Thank you for joining us for the Ministry of the Word at Redeemed Christian Fellowship in Phoenix, Arizona. We hope the Ministry of the Word will be a blessing to you.
Okay. Hello, welcome to our afternoon service. Thank you for joining us, being with us today. We appreciate your support for this work that we're doing here. God is so good. We have been teaching on Pastor Walter's manual, Women of Faith. We started last week on the book of Esther, and we are going to finish the book of Esther today. So we're to the point where Esther begins to act out her faith. We know that they were fasting and preparing to trust God to deliver them from the annihilation of the Jews. And so that's where we're picking up right now. So it is to be noted that if her campaign, she was going to expose what Haman was trying to plot against them. So it is to be noted that if her campaign to expose Haman failed, it could certainly lead to her death, because we know that Haman was highly favored by the king at the time. And so she knew what she was up against. She knew she had to be very careful in how she handled the situation, because it could lead to her death, which meant that she had to put her trust in the living God, that she might obtain favor and honor in the presence of the king. So the book of Esther is noted by many that God is not mentioned in this book, that God specifically, his name is not mentioned in this book. However, no one can deny the demonstration of faith revealed by Mordecai, Esther, and the Jewish people. We know what the Jewish people believed in. We know who they believed in more specifically. So we know that all of their actions and trust and faith was in the living God. So not to mention the acts of Mordecai and Esther, which both revealed them tremendous amounts of faith in a time when most people's hearts would faint or fail them. Most people would probably like Pastor said, faint or fail them. They would buckle under the pressure of what they were, the situation they were facing. Stress or fear would cause them to not succeed in what they were facing. But they both exhibited a tremendous amount of wisdom and faith in God. Now Esther put on her royal apparel and went and stood in the inner court of the king's house as the king was sitting on his throne, so that when the king saw Esther standing in the inner court, she obtained favor in his sight, and he held out his golden scepter to her in acceptance that allowed her to approach him. It's interesting that she put on her best apparel to approach the king, something that she recognized that he would appreciate, and it showed that she honored him. It's interesting because obviously his first wife did the opposite. She dishonored him by refusing to go before the king. And Esther put on her best, and she stood and waited for him to notice her. So as she drew near to him, she touched the top of his scepter, showing her awareness that she had been accepted in his sight. Again, that also shows that she's honoring him, that she recognizes who he is, and she's showing her, I've been recognized. I know that you've recognized me, and like it's just kind of, to me, it shows like a sense of like, I appreciate that you did that, mm-hmm. An appreciation, awareness of. So Esther, we're going to read Esther 5:1 through 2.
It says, "Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. The king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter."
And so now the king asked her, "What would you like, or what do you desire, and what is your request?" And he said, "I will give you up to half the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it seems good to the king, let the king and Haman come this day or tonight to the dinner that I have prepared for the king." So it was at this dinner where Haman was present that the king asked Esther again, "What do you require, and it shall be given to you? What is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done or performed for you." So Esther then replied by saying, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them. Then Esther goes on to say, then I will answer your question. So it's interesting. She didn't come right out and say, this is what's happening. She knew to be careful in her approach and to take her time. She didn't rush through this process to try to fix what was going on. She was wise and cautious in her approach. So we can see the wisdom of Esther unfolding. Haman was so self-centered and excited that he would be included in a banquet that was specifically prepared for him and the king. So this is what he's thinking is going on. As he was leaving, he saw Mordecai, and he expected Mordecai to pay him some sort of reverence because of his position with the king and over all the king's advisors. However, Mordecai did not honor him by not standing up and acknowledging his presence. So Haman was full of indignation. However, he was able to compose himself, and when he got home, he sent and called for his friends and his wife, and he began to speak of his wealth and his children and how that he had been promoted by the king and had been advanced over all the king's advisors and servants. It's interesting how he's bragging about himself and all that he has and all that he's gained. Then he began to speak of the favor he was being shown by the queen, and then said, tomorrow I have been invited again to another banquet with the king. Then he began to speak of Mordecai's disrespect for him. His wife and his friends encouraged him to speak to the king in order to hang Mordecai, so they're egging him on, like, ooh, you need to have him hanged. The advice he received from his wife and his friends pleased him, and then he had gallows to be made in order to hang Mordecai. If you want to read that specifically, it's in the book. It's in chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. So while all this was unfolding, and as Haman was advancing his plot against Mordecai and the Jewish people, it just so happened that one night the king could not sleep. So he commanded the books of the records of the chronicles to be brought, and as they were read to him, he realized that Mordecai had once saved his life. With Esther's help, Mordecai revealed that there were 2 of the king's chamberlains that were seeking to kill him, the king. So the king asked what honor and dignity had been done unto Mordecai for this, and the king's servant replied that nothing had been done for him. So he realized that Mordecai had saved his life, and he wanted to know if anything had been done to reward him for saving his life, and they said that nothing had been done.
So this is recounting what you just talked about in verses 1 through 3. It says, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hands on the king. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then the king's servant that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him.
The events found in the chronicles that were read to the king in Esther 6, 1 through 3 took place before Haman had been promoted over all the king's chamberlains. So when Mordecai saved his life, this was before Haman had been promoted. So then he's reading of a past event that happened before Haman had even been promoted. The king asked his servant who was in the court, and the servant said, Haman. So Haman standing in the court. This is interesting about the court, that now Haman was there to speak to the king regarding Mordecai and his plans to hang him on the gallows that he had made specifically for him. The court was a place where those who wanted to speak to the king for whatever reason would go. It was a place of honor, and only those the king had honored were allowed to go into the court to wait for him. So Haman was there specifically to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. Mm-hmm. The king had summoned Haman. Now remember, Haman is looking to hang Mordecai, and the king was looking to honor Mordecai. We can see God's hand in all of this, and the type of favor that Mordecai walked in with God and the Jewish people. It's interesting how isn't that funny how Haman was wanting to do something really bad, and God on the other side of behind the scenes was doing all of this to make sure Mordecai was honored and that he was presented to the king in a good way. Mm-hmm. So, and at the same time, we can also see God's favor upon Esther and the type of godly wisdom that she walked in, for her plan to expose Haman was unfolding. Haman's own vanity and sense of importance, which can be interpreted as pride, was about to bring him down. Certainly the scripture that says pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall cannot be ignored. Haman's own arrogance was about to be used against him.
So in chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, it says, and the king said, who is in the court. Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to honor more than myself?
That's funny, isn't it? He's thinking, this is about me.
Right.
So notice verse 6 says that Haman thought in his heart, surely when a man's heart is filled with pride, their sense of importance will eventually bring them down. The blinders of Haman's pride led him into deception, for he thought that there was no one else as important as himself who the king would honor. So Haman answered the king thinking that he would be honored, saying, The man whom the king delights to honor should be dressed in all the king's royal apparel, including the king's crown, even to the riding of the king's horse. And then he said, And then let the apparel and the horse be delivered by the king's most noble servants, so that they can dress the one you seek to honor. And then allow them to go through the city streets and proclaim, This is what one receives whom the king honors. So it's interesting because this is all things he thought would be done for himself. Obviously, he's thinking like, what's the best thing I can do for myself? This is extremely significant and reveals the nature of pride, to think that you could put on the king's clothing and crown and ride upon his horse, which was never worn by anyone ever and could be seen as a serious violation, unless, of course, someone could get the king to authorize it. Otherwise, it could be punishable by death under the law. So Haman's underlying motive as a narcissistic individual, smothered in self-interest and self-promoting, was to let the people know that he was equal, the same, and identical in value, status, rights, power, wisdom, and glory as the king, and should be honored as such. So that's what he's thinking, like, this is the best I could do for myself. I'm going to be seen as the same as the king. So this was Haman's longing. He certainly fit into one of the highest forms of pride and self-deception that I can recall. And it led to his undoing and demise, for when the overall intents of his heart were revealed, it brought about a hard fall.
And this is a recap in verses 7 through 9 of what you had just read. It says, And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighted to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, the horse that the king rideth upon, the crown royal which is set upon his head, and let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princesses, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighted to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighted to honor.
So to Haman's vanity, the king agrees with him, but to his surprise, Haman is ordered to do everything he thought he would be done for him to be done for Mordecai. So the king said to Haman, Hurry and take the apparel and the horse as you have said, and do even to Mordecai the Jew. That was in verse 10. And then he goes on to say, Make sure that nothing goes wrong and it is done exactly as you have said. So Haman then took the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the streets of the city, proclaiming before him, Thus shall be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor. That was verse 11. Mordecai went back to the king's gates, and Haman wasted no time in going to his house and covering his head and mourning over what had just happened. The act of covering one's head in a situation like this shows his distress and grief. It's a type of mourning that reveals that a person is experiencing tremendous loss and does not have the fortitude to completely recover from this experience. I mean, you've heard people say, I'm never gonna recover from this. I'm never gonna be able to move on. So that's what he was experiencing. Haman tells his wife and his friends what had happened to him. His friends, which were considered to be wise men, told his wife that if Mordecai's heritage was that of a Jew, that their fall had begun. Hey, don't worry about it. Their fall's coming. His time's coming, and they would not prevail against him and their plot to destroy him, and that they would surely come to ruin before him. So while all this was going on, the king's chamberlain showed up and hastened to bring Haman to the second banquet that Esther had prepared for him and the king. That's in verses 12 through 14. So they're like, hey, you need to get going. He's feeling sorry for himself. They're trying to cheer him up that the time's coming to an end, and now he had to leave again. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared for him. Again, this is the second banquet. The banquet was called the banquet of wine. This type of banquet would have been used to influence and bring favor, or you could even say impress those who were invited to the banquet. So during the banquet, the king once again asked Esther, What is your petition, and it shall be granted you, and what is thy request, and it shall be done for you, even to half the kingdom. The queen once again answered with a sense of deep respect and honor for the king by saying, If I have found favor in your sight, and if it please the king, my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. So you still see the difference between Esther and his first wife, Queen Vashti, because Queen Vashti didn't care about what the king thought. She ignored his request, but Esther honored the king by saying, if it pleases you, if I find favor with you. So this might sound a bit confusing, but what Esther was requesting was for her own life and her people's lives to be spared, or you could say the Jews' lives to be spared. She goes on to say, for we are sold, me and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. So the word sold here means to be given over to death. It is something that it is experienced only by a slave who has no control over their own destiny. So notice that Esther was wise enough to embrace her favor with the king before the first banquet was even accepted. She made reference to, if I have found favor in the sight of the king. During the first dinner, she made a similar comment, if I have favor with the king. And now for the third time, in the second dinner with the king, she starts off by saying, if I have found favor in thy sight. So her strategy was all about enhancing the favor she had with the king, and she showed the fortitude and patience to bring this about. This type of wisdom can only come from the Holy Ghost. Esther yielded herself to the wisdom of God throughout the whole process. And then Esther goes on to say, if we had been sold for slaves, I'd have held my tongue. So what Esther was saying here was that if we had only been sold as slaves, I would not say anything, for our affliction would not be compared with the damage this would do to the king. So she is recognizing that if we were only sold as slaves, the damage to you would be worse than what we would experience. Meaning that Esther viewed what Haman was doing would tarnish the king's reputation in the eyes of the people throughout the kingdom. So then the king asked Queen Esther, who is the person that had done this, and where is he who dares to presume in his heart to destroy you and your people? Then Esther boldly proclaims, our adversary and enemy in all his wickedness is Haman. So at these words, Haman was struck with fear. Scripture shows that the king was very angry, and he arose from the feast full of wrath and went to the palace garden. So he walked out. Haman's afraid. And Haman stood up and began to plead for his life to the queen, for she realized that the king was determined to put an end to Haman's plot. When the king returned to the banquet, he found that Haman had fallen upon the couch where Esther was, which was a big mistake, for the king saw his actions as forcibly assaulting the queen in his presence. So he walked in and saw Haman fallen upon the couch that the queen was at. I mean, like, this is a man you don't want to cross sides with. You don't want. So one of the king's servants said, the gallows were made for Mordecai, the one who warned the king and saved his life. Then the king said, hang him on it. So Haman was hanged on the same gallows prepared for Mordecai. That's justice. So this pleased the king, and his anger was pacified. But the story's not over. There is more. Haman is now gone out of the picture, but they have to undo what had been done. So in chapter 8, we see that the king gave Haman's house to Esther the queen. It was at this time that Mordecai arrived and came before the king, for Esther had told who Mordecai was to her. So now the king realized that Mordecai was her uncle, was her family. So it is well known by the king that Mordecai was a Jew, and therefore so was his queen. The king's response was to take off his ring, which represented his authority given to those who had the authority to act on his behalf. And he gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. It is important to know through all of this that Esther showed a tremendous amount of respect, honor, and reverence for the king. After all this took place, she fell at his feet and besought him with tears to reverse all the damage that Haman had done to the Jewish people. Once again, as at the first, the king held out his scepter towards Esther, and Esther arose and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in thy sight, if it seems right before the king, let there be written letters to reverse what Haman has devised. And the king honored the queen Esther's request. The king also granted the Jews, which were gathered throughout his kingdom, to defend themselves against anyone who held to what Haman had done because of his hatred toward the Jews. So he recognized that there may be people who still carry out this plot to kill the Jews, so he gave them permission to defend themselves. They were also given authority to pursue their enemies and destroy or slay all those who hated them and held the same animosity towards them as Haman did. They viewed them as their enemies. You could read all of Esther to find all of this verified in Scripture. So we wanted to bring out the fact that God was delivering his people from men who possessed evil and cruel intentions and desired to annihilate them. It must be understood that God was interested in preserving the lives of his people and will not allow their enemies to triumph over them. So that was God's intention He was preserving his people, and he wasn't going to allow the enemies to destroy them. So on the same day, the Jews were supposed to be on the day of Haman's plot, where they were supposed to be destroyed. The Jews slayed 500 men in the capital on the first day, 300 on the second day, and over all the kingdom, 75,000 people set out on carrying Haman's decrees were destroyed. So 75,000 not Jewish people, the people who were going to kill the Jews, those people were destroyed. Also, they executed Haman's 10 sons and then hung them on gallows. So anyone who might have still been influenced by Haman was now out of the picture. It must be remembered that all of this happened because God was delivering his people from total annihilation. The wisdom and strategies of God to defend his people is to be remembered, for he not only delivered Esther, Mordecai, and the people from certain death and annihilation, but he also brought about the destruction of their enemies. Esther was very unique in the application of her faith, for we understand that everything she received from God was divinely orchestrated in her heart. She can certainly be seen as a pioneer for all women who desire to be led, guided, and directed by God through the attributes of the heart. If there's anything to be remembered about Esther's faith, it is that faith, patience, and wisdom work together. Obviously, she was very patient. She had a tremendous amount of faith in God and trust in God, and she walked in the wisdom that he gave her. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, it's good.
God is good. Thank you for joining us and being with us today. We hope that you appreciated the story on Esther, because I know I did. I remember going through these notes when Pastor was writing them out and being amazed at the revelation that was coming out of it. We love you guys. We hope you guys have a blessed week.
Thank you for joining us today. If the ministry of the Word has been a blessing to you, please consider contributing to the work of the ministry at www.redeemedcf.breeze.com/give/online. You can also text to give by texting the amount you would like to give to 602-962-3848. If you have a testimony of how the ministry of the Word has been a blessing to you, please send us a message on one of our social media platforms. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for your continued support of the work here at Redeemed Christian Fellowship.